just last night, there was some news about you, Renée, broken by Platformer, the online publication, reported that Stanford University is dissolving the Stanford Internet Observatory, where you did a lot of the work that we're going to be talking about today. So what can you tell us about what's going on and what has happened to you and your work?
I don't really know everything that's going on. I think that's been one of the challenges. I think since the investigations into our work, sort of spurious investigations into our work, began last year. For those who don't know, we were subpoenaed by Representatives Jordan and Bishop. We were then sued by Stephen Miller. There was a lot of lawfare. We were, kind of incorporated as sort of sidecar villains into the Murthy v. Missouri case, which was heard at SCOTUS and should be decided in the next 2 weeks. There's been a lot of challenges as the university has tried to figure out what its appetite is for certain types of work, where that work will be done, who will lead that work. And I think they still really just don't know. So, news story came out framing it as Stanford is dissolving SIO. Stanford says it is not dissolving SIO in their statement, that they're going to operate it under new management and perhaps with a new focus. I hope that that's true, because the Internet Observatory has done incredible amounts of work over the last 5 years. I've been incredibly proud of what we've accomplished, and it would be very, very frustrating to see it killed because of a conspiracy theory and a right-wing media machine smear campaign.
All right, so we're going to get to the right-wing media campaign in a moment, but just to clarify, you are no longer associated with the Stanford Internet Observatory to the extent some iteration of it may still exist. Is that right?
That is correct.
What happens to you now?
Well, I mean, right now I'm on book tour. And then after that, again, what I am most proud of, what we managed to accomplish at SIO, was the sheer we had an incredible pipeline from quantitative empirical research through to policy and public communication. I think that needs to exist in the world, and my hope is that I get to continue doing it. And we had work on child safety. I mean, actually a huge chunk of our work was on child safety. We did some groundbreaking work identifying self-generated CSAM rings on Instagram, right? Kind of child exploitation content and self-generated content that teenagers were selling illegally on Instagram. That was a front page story in the Wall Street Journal. Ironically, a week prior to that, we had identified that something had broken at Twitter and that there were what are called photo DNA hits, which is known child exploitation content showing up on Twitter. And of course, we immediately reached out to Twitter to let them know that that had happened. Elon is now gloating over our demise, but we did in fact tell him there is CSAM on your platform. We did work on evaluating the cyber tip line, right? When this kind of content is found on platforms, who triages it? And then a lot of my work, my integration in that is what happens as AI generated content comes into the picture here. How do we think about the triaging of those types of reports? We did work evaluating the presence of illegal material in AI training data sets. I mean, I could go on and on. We did a ton of work on influence operations. There's another story that broke today about the Pentagon running an anti-vaccine sock puppet campaign to discourage people from taking China's vaccine, which is actually a horrific thing. And that work cites our prior exposures of Pentagon influence operations because it turns out it was related to the same network and the same contractor. So again, the work that we've done has been so far-reaching and so impactful. Our kind of exposure of the Pentagon content led to a reevaluation of what kind of ethics and guidelines should be in place for those kinds of operations in the future. So I think, for me, I just want to be able to continue doing that kind of empirical work to policy pipeline. I think it's really important to do impact-driven work in social media research, and that's what I intend to do.
All right, so you've kind of described the work of the Stanford Internet Observatory in significant part, but I want to tack back and ask you what was the Stanford Internet Observatory? This is an institution that has been around for a while now under your leadership and Alex Demos's leadership. What was it that either got shut down or didn't get shut down, but you're no longer associated
this
with?
sort of Schrodinger's state of alive or dead at this point. I think we describe it as a program for, interdisciplinary research program that studies abuse of current information technologies. And so it had 4 buckets. It had trust and safety research. So when we talk about child safety, maybe brigading and harassment, spam and scams, that kind of stuff falls in there. We had trust and safety courses, a trust and safety journal, a trust and safety conference, just an incredible field building exercise to help trust and safety become more of a discipline, right? More of a rigorous, robust discipline where students are taught how to think in those terms as they then go on to work at tech companies. Because of course, Stanford is in the Valley and a lot of the students will go work in tech. Then there was work on information integrity. So propaganda, influence operations, rumors, disinformation campaigns fell into another bucket. We had what we called emerging tech, which said, how do we think about ways in which new types of technologies transform trust and safety? We did some really groundbreaking work on spam and scams that used generative AI, right? Chatbots that use large language models. How do we detect them? How do we find out what they're doing? And then the 4th bucket was policy. And that was the kind of catch-all where we said, okay, here's our empirical research into all of this stuff. How do we think about what should happen as a result? What is the public interest kind of best practice or solution, if you will, or mitigation that comes out of studying these types of harms? And sometimes that might be an engagement with a platform to say, hey, I remember early on during COVID saying, hey, maybe you should label state media, right? China's really kind of doing a number over here with unattributed accounts, just sort of saying things. Or it might be engaging with regulators. How do you think about research or transparency or data access? How do you think about privacy? How do you think about CDA 230, right? So many different policy areas. So that was the sort of full scope of work was, again, empirical research into the 3 buckets, and then policy outputs and public engagement as the 4th. And then we did publish in academic journals. So despite the fact that, we were a center that envisioned our work as being research in the public interest, we do all have a pile of, properly peer-reviewed papers and everything from Annals of Internal Medicine to Journal of Communication. And it's just an incredible body of work that we accomplished over the last 5 years.
All right. So all of that sounds completely wonderful. And it does not sound like the thing that an academic institution would say, get rid of the leadership of and maybe shut down or maybe reorient. And I would simply ask you the question how this came about, except that conveniently you happen to have written a book about the process by which things like this happen, and that along the way tells the story of how this happened. And so I want to answer that why question through the lens of your book, which is called Invisible Rulers. And let me start by asking you, what was the issue that you set out to write about as before you became an exhibit in the issue that you were writing about?
I wanted to write about how public opinion is shaped today. I wanted to write about how propaganda works today. I see those two things as being very interrelated. And I think that as we've moved into a completely, now in some ways mature, right? And most people are on social media worldwide. You have an entirely new ecosystem that's many-to-many communication, as opposed to prior media ecosystems, which were much more one-to-many, right? A broadcaster saying something and people seeing it. I wanted to write about the way in which that process had transformed, as you have influencers, for example, who are relatively ordinary people who just grow a large following, who are really trusted by their audience, who have the reach of media, who often make money on their content, but they're not seen as media. So I wanted to write a book about how that process of opinion shaping had changed, and particularly the role that it was now playing in political discourse. I think that there's been too much focus on things like the algorithm, and not enough on that interplay between influencers, algorithms, and crowds. And so the book really tries to just explain, here is how the system works today, and here's how public opinion is shaped. It's pretty, I think, descriptive, not even a normative statement. It's sort of saying, here is how this works, here it is, and then here is what comes out of it.
All right, so let's follow that trajectory of looking at what it is and looking at what comes out of it, and then looking at how it engaged with you. But before we do that, I just want to ask, because it's a great story and because it's illuminating in its own right, how you got involved in this issue. What was if you talk at one point in the book about you becoming the Darth Vader persona, all good villains, including Darth Vader, have an origin story. So what's the Renée Darth DiResta's origin story in this story?
Well, they would tell you that it was that I interned for the CIA and, when I was an undergraduate, and then they waved their hands kind of, and they,
Okay, but I've spent more time at the CIA than you have over the last, 25 years.
This is kind of the point, right?
All right. They would say that, but,
well, they would say that, but it's
let
bullshit.
Me just say, it is bullshit. So what is the real origin story of your involvement in this whole set of issues?
Yeah, I was, so in 2013, I had my first baby, and I was living in San Francisco at the time. And I started
not working for the CIA.
Not working for the CIA. I had a startup like everybody else.
You were working for some kind of hedge fund, right?
No, at that point, I worked at Jane Street for about 7.5 years. After I left the CIA, I went to Jane Street. And I was there through the financial crisis. I had a really interesting experience, financial crisis, European debt crisis. We can talk about that at some point. It was just a kind of a really incredible place to be, and right there sort of in the thick of it. But it wasn't where I'd really seen myself. And I majored in computer science. I wanted to kind of go back into tech, so to speak. So I moved to the Valley, and I worked in venture capital for a couple of years to try to get my bearings, meet people. I was useless as an engineer by that point. So I was curious, what would I go do? How would I get myself back in some kind of technical role? And then I started a company, had a baby, and, started writing a lot about what was happening. As I was kind of in the startup, you have the Disneyland measles outbreak happened in 2014. You have the beginnings of kind of calls in California in the state Senate to say, how can we improve vaccination rates in California public schools? And I had done a whole big research project independently at night. I was bored in venture capital. I was tired of just talking to people. So I started downloading these data sets and playing with them. And so when this happened, I started reaching out actually to the to the state senators saying hey, can I maybe help? Can I show you what I'm seeing here? Can I show you where the anti-vaccine movement is, what it's doing, how it works, quantitatively? Can I make network graphs for you and explain to you why this community of people is so effective at getting their message out? Can I also show you that there is no pro-vaccine counter movement? There are anti-vaccine influencers, but there are no pro-vaccine influencers. Why do we have that asymmetry?
And just to be clear, you are pro-vaccine.
Oh, yes, very much so. Yes, absolutely. I considered it sort of egregious that, sort of bad information. This was at the time, long prior to COVID, this was the whole vaccines cause autism conspiracy theory that had been debunked in research over and over and over and over again. And yet there's still measles outbreaks happening in California. And so,
because I think this is I think this is actually a really important point, that this is, if you're looking for the core of who Renée DiResta is, it is not the censor in chief. It is not, the CIA censorship operative. It's a person who is fanatically pro-vaccine and doesn't like San Francisco political culture.
I had a lot of opinions about San Francisco political
culture. Is that fair?
Culture. Yeah, well, it was, I felt like policy should be rooted in accurate information. That was my wild, unpopular opinion. That school vaccine policy should be tied to evidence, and that's how that should happen. And I just thought, like, okay, well, how do we grow a pro-vaccine movement? And that was when I realized, like, wow, we can run ad campaigns for very little money. We can do incredible precision targeting with absolutely no skills required. You could run automated accounts that just sat there pumping out your point of view. And that was what the opposition was doing. So that anytime anybody searched for a phrase, like, for example, this bill that I was working on, SB 277, what you would see was like what was most recent. So you had a real incentive to be pushing out high volume content so that whenever anybody searched for the hashtag, they would see your stuff. And I felt like, okay, so this is how public opinion is shaped today, right? We want the public to be aware that this bill is happening, and we want to counterspeak against the anti-vaccine movement. So how do we build an infrastructure to do that? And that was what I started writing about. And I wound up writing for Wired because I also started getting, these insane recommendations, right? I got, as a new mom, I was getting referred anti-vaccine groups constantly. Facebook was just pushing it to me. And then what started to happen, I created an account to go join some of these groups. So I was kind of curious to see, okay, well, what happens in the groups? And then it started pushing me Pizzagate groups. And then it started pushing me QAnon groups a year later. So I said, well, okay, well, we've really got some crazy stuff that's happening in recommendation engines, in trending topics. All of this is so easily manipulatable. That's actually kind of horrifying, right? And so I became a little bit of like a...
And this was long before there was a Stanford Internet Observatory.
Oh, long before. This was 2015. Yeah, this was 2015, 2016.
So this is you being a mom at night when you're not, when you're supposed to be like doing your venture capital homework.
Well, when I was, basically, yes. It became my night job. It became my like 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Like, this is what I do for fun at night. But no, I felt like I had kind of seen the future, right? As we were doing the fight for this bill, I just felt like when we got doxxed, we got harassed. One of our kind of like co-mom organizers had been a lawyer. And so her address was on the bar website, and they took it and they posted it to Facebook, and they said, hey, everybody send her Christmas cards. And they started trying to figure out if they could, to how far from her house they had to be if they wanted to show up to have a protest, right? So all of a sudden, it also became clear to me that if you did engage in advocacy, if you were a passionate advocate, then you were really all of a sudden at the mercy of whatever happened to you on the internet, right? And that was very quickly like hopping offline. You could use your free speech and you could advocate for yourself, but the cost of that was pretty amazing, actually. The fact that you were likely to get doxxed, you were likely to get harassed, people would show up to your house. And this was, again, long before COVID. And I just felt like, we had really entered sort of an incredible new world in which, yes, we all had the power to shape public opinion and run advocacy campaigns and do everything else. But there were also some really weird things that were happening with algorithms, with social norms. And the book tries to get at that, right? Why do these things happen? What is a technological issue? What is a social or normative issue? And how do these things kind of fit together? And how do we think about that going forward?
All right. So that's how you get into it. The whole first third of the book, maybe first half of the book, is the development of a kind of description of the new social media influence ecosystem. And it's quite different, I think, from most people's conception of that ecosystem. You build it around three sort of pillars. The influencer, which most people don't think of as a political thing, but think of as a kind of fashion or celebrity or business, so sort of self-promotion kind of thing. The platform and the crowd. And so I want you to describe for us how a an information ecosystem built around these three pillars works, and how it's different from prior informational regimes.
So in prior informational regimes, usually what I say is you've got a top-down model, right? So you have consensus. Consensus happens as everybody is seeing largely the same information, and that information comes from media broadcasting to the public, and then the public talks about it amongst themselves, right? That's always been a piece of it. It has never been a hypodermic model where media says something and you believe it, but it's that process of talking about it with your peers, which used to be also very geographically constrained. And the internet really kind of blows that up. So what happens today is more of a bottom-up model, where the media actually is often reporting on what happens on the internet. You see these stories, right? Some people on the internet are saying, this story was trending, this person was trending, there's a new main character of Twitter today, right? And so what's happening on social media becomes a thing that actually media reports on. And the way that the influencer algorithm and crowd engage on social media, you can't have one without the other two. There's no separating them. So the influencer is an influencer because the algorithm often surfaces and curates their content, right? It's recommending it, it's pushing it out. And the crowd, the fandom, is also sharing it, which then gives signal to the algorithm as more people begin to share it. So these three things are not really separable. The influencer, meanwhile, recognizes that they have to produce content that is appealing to the algorithm in order to get visibility, and also appealing to the crowd so that the crowd wants to share it. And this is where you start to see things like audience capture happening, where an influencer who maybe starts off talking about one topic or having one alignment will occasionally become kind of more and more extreme. People often describe it as like, wow, that guy really went down the rabbit hole. But that's in part happening because the influencer is producing the kind of content that the crowd is going to want to share. So they are being shaped by the beliefs and actions and opinions of their fans as well. And so this kind of ecosystem functions in a way that, maybe somebody says something on the internet, says something kind of, just in casual chatter. We'll use the election as an example, right? In 2020, somebody posts a photograph of a ballots in a dumpster, right? This actually happened, and says, look, they're not disposing of ballots. They're throwing away our ballots. This was something that came up in 2020. And then they tag in influencers. And then the influencer decides to take that content from that guy who has maybe 4 followers and push it out to their 2 million followers. And so the influencer is kind of pulling that content out, pushing it out to more people. Then their entire fandom sees it, begins to share it. The algorithm picks it up and pushes it out to still more people. And so through that process, you have this kind of big if true model of event reporting, if you will, or event discussion, where the facts and the discussion are happening in real time through this kind of online rumor mill. So it's very, very different than here are the reported facts that have been vetted by some journalist somewhere, and maybe the journalist is not ethical, maybe the journalist is trying to protect a government source or relationship, but it was just a very different way of kind of arriving at what we think to be facts or truth even. And that becomes one of the, that distinction between top down and bottom up is what a lot of the book tries to focus on, explaining that the bottom up is actually incredibly powerful and getting more and more powerful today.
So much of the second half of the book is a series of almost case studies, although they're written in a much more engaging form than the word case study suggests. So talk us through some of them. What are the, as you try to apply this framework to, it's really 4, I guess, kind of high profile events. What do you, or series of events, what do you find?
So one of the chapters in the book focuses on election 2020. One chapter focuses on COVID. One chapter focuses on state actors, because I think a lot of people have this belief that Russia and China are incredibly impactful. And so I wanted to discuss how they are there, but they are not as impactful as the rest of what's happening. So trying to put that in perspective. And then the last set of case studies kind of focuses on harassment. right? What happens when, uses the example of Dr. Peter Hotez and a couple of other folks who during COVID did have people show up to their house, right? In that model of somebody on the internet is mad at you, and then all of a sudden those people actually show up to your house, right? So, so what I tried to do with the case studies was just explain, hopefully in an entertaining way, that didn't feel like a case study, what we saw as we looked at it. So from the perspective of a researcher who was looking at and studying viral rumors, disinformation campaigns, and viral narratives during these periods, and showing,
and
like,
to be clear, when you say we here, you mean the Stanford Internet
Observatory.
Yeah.
I mean, I draw pretty heavily on work that I did over the last 5 years at SIO because, because it is broad and incredibly impactful and important and, excellent work.
Right. I'm just trying to link the story, the story you tell in the book to the story we started here. That's the same Stanford Internet Observatory, right? That Stanford just maybe shut down or maybe didn't.
Exactly. Yes, it is.
Okay. Just checking.
Yes. So the book draws on the work that we did, and it tells the story of what we actually did, not the weird right-wing conspiracy theories, not the Jim Jordan fabrications, not the cherry picking one email out of out of 40,000 to try to create some appearance of guilt. No, it tells the story of the work as we did it, as a research project, a bunch of research projects that involved students, because we were at a university. Students were doing this work too. And so in the case of the election, it describes how election delegitimization rumors began to snowball, how one built on the next, on the next, on the next, and how this process of influencer algorithm crowd making things go viral, allegations of ballot fraud, theft, mules, you name it, that the election was rigged, stolen, delegitimizing preemptively delegitimizing it. Right. This was unfortunately, this was the Trump and his allies preemptively delegitimizing it constantly for the better part of 6 months. And so we describe that because one thing that was, that the right wing says about us is that we, quote, targeted conservatives by accurately reporting on what was happening. There were, we talk about some of the instances in which the left has election rumors or says unvalidated things or, kind of blows things out of proportion. All that stuff is in there. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at who was trying to delegitimize the 2020 election, it was one side. And no matter how much we might like to gloss over that or to have a both sidesism, it was not both sides. And so the book really lays out what was happening in a very mechanical sense. Here is how it happened. Here's how that snowballing creates a entire alternate reality. Bespoke reality is the term I use for the people who are in it, where most liberals didn't see this stuff going by because they were over in their corner of the internet, and these delegitimization rumors they were not even seeing them. So I try to explain how you can be on the same internet, the same platform, but your version of reality, the thing that you are outraged about that day is something that a small niche group of people is seeing. And unfortunately, in the case of 2020, this sort of, this snowballing does eventually lead to offline impact. It eventually leads to January 6th. So trying to kind of connect the dots on, there's a lot of people, I think, particularly maybe a little bit older generation that think, oh, this is just some people on the internet, right? That was a thing the CDC said to me once, actually, in a meeting about the vaccine autism problem. They're like, well, no. Eventually they trust their pediatrician, and those other people are just some people on the internet. And I thought, wow, this is a really big divide. The divide between people who see what happens on the internet as a driving, motivating force for a whole lot of people, versus the people who think that ultimately the sort of mainstream media credentialed expert wins out in the end. And that's what the book really goes into.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the other three, I don't want to call them case studies, but examples. Let's talk about COVID.
So the COVID chapter tries to focus on where institutions went wrong. If there is one chapter that people and institutions read, I would really like it very much to be that one. And that's because it goes into how the reticence to communicate the lack of transparency, the lack of understanding of what was happening on the internet as everybody was, stuck in their houses, doom scrolling on their phones. The public health officials communicate in a very sporadic way after they've come to some kind of scientific consensus. Meanwhile, the internet has formed an opinion already long before that. And I talk about how this happened with masks. And then I talk about how the anti-vaccine activists, who ironically appear in the first section talking about the measles outbreak in California, have gone from having, tens of thousands of followers then to having hundreds of thousands of followers in the time of COVID. And describing that gap as public health officials are there speaking occasionally only after they have decided something is accurate, or in some cases, being a little bit misleading. And I try to describe where that kind of gap in public trust comes from. And then also explaining that while they screw up in certain ways that I spend quite a bit of time on, there's also this other group of people who exist to delegitimize them, who profit from delegitimizing them. And so there are two sides to the coin here. One, the institutions did not cover themselves in glory. They did not update their communication style. They did not understand what they were dealing with. They did not do a good job in a lot of ways, particularly around messaging, around the vaccine and everything else. But on the flip side, you do also have groups of incentivized individuals for whom undermining authority is how they make their money and grow their own audience. So trying to explain to people that this is the sort of weird incentive structure driving the narratives and the politics around COVID.
All right. State actors.
State actors.
For a lot of people, the idea that you can blame everything that has ever gone wrong on the internet, on the GRU, because 2016 election and reasons and Donald Trump, is a kind of intuitively attractive idea. I've always thought the Russian impact on the 2016 election was totally nefarious and totally overstated. But how much of this crowd's platform influencer problem is really a Russia problem or a China problem or an Iran problem, and how much, to the extent that it's not organically that, how does it interact with the effectively separate Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran problems?
So one thing that Russia realizes early on, long before the US quite gets there, is that they already have the narratives they need because the American polity is so already vitriolic and polarized, and that they don't have to do a whole lot of work to create their own content. And you actually see this reflected. So I did the work for CISI in 2018, right? Looking at the Russia data sets that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube.
Right. So wait, back up, and tell us, first of all, what is CISI? And secondly, what is the work that you did for them?
Jargon. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So I was asked by Senators Warner and Burr, it was a bipartisan effort, to look at the data sets.
And this was not in your CIA capacity.
No,
right?
No, it was not. This was in late 2017 they asked, and I think early 2018 I got the data set. And I worked on it in 2018. That was the majority of the work that I did, because it was about there were hundreds of thousands of, posts on on Facebook and Instagram. There were millions of posts on Twitter. There were hours and hours of YouTube videos. So I spent a lot of time in this data set, and we did both quantitative and qualitative evaluations of what was in there. And one thing I will say is we did not try to answer the question, did this swing the election? Because we had no visibility into how people reacted to it, right? So we had engagement data. So we could say, this got this many likes, this was this popular, but we couldn't really say anything related to whether those people were simply the already converted, seeing content that was likely to appeal to them, or if they were doing anything that was vaguely persuasive. And the sense that we began to get as we looked at all of these, many hours of footage and tons of posts, is that they only tried to be persuasive on very specific issues. And I'll go into those in a second. But what they spent most of their time doing was activating American identity groups that already existed, and then reinforcing pride in those identities before pitting them against what they could frame as the opposite identity. So you had groups that were pretending to be veterans, talking about the very real issue of veteran mental health, veteran benefits, veteran homelessness. And then they had a couple of pro-Muslim groups that were talking about things like US wars leading to Muslim refugees, or anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia, this sort of thing. And what they would do is they would say, we are proud of our identity as veterans. Why are those refugee immigrants getting our resources, right? And so they would create tension between the two groups by taking an existing point of view and just kind of exacerbating it. The only areas where we saw them really trying to persuade people were in the Republican primary, right? They ran a lot of stuff, denigrating Marco Rubio, denigrating Ted Cruz. They had a Tea Party page, and the Tea Party page, remember Cruz, of course, was like the Tea Party guy. They just kind of ran this persuasion campaign trying to get people to see Trump as the future of the Tea Party, not Ted Cruz. So they're really, they start off trying to angle for Rand Paul. And then when they have no success, Rand Paul, of course, has his own problems. They pivot the attention of the audience to Trump. So you do see that sort of attempt at a persuasion campaign. And then the other area where they try to work on persuasion, and this was kind of a really strange one, was on the Syrian war. And that's because Russia had particular interests in the Syrian war, whereas most Americans paid no attention to it, couldn't, pick out Syria on a map. But all of a sudden you have them trying to run these persuasion campaigns to undermine support for the U.S. in that conflict, the U.S. involvement in that conflict. So it's a whole area where they manage to insert themselves into real, authentic conversations. And so they serve as very good, gasoline on the fire, but they are not as impactful as the real influencers, because you never really see the Russian trolls grow a following of more than about 100,000 followers, right? To a Twitter account or a Facebook page. So they don't have this followership in the millions, and that really becomes that's like a gap for them. They cannot get into they can't get the mass reach that they want without that real authenticity. And the same thing is true of China and Iran. They never hit those numbers. So they're always there on the periphery. They're always trying. They do have, some successes making certain things go viral, but they are not nearly as effective as an actual authentic influencer.
Right. So a Russian fake influencer is a rounding error on an organic American right-wing or left-wing real influencer.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So you open, I believe it is chapter 8 of your book, by observing that it is an odd feeling to describe all these effects and then become the subject of one of the campaigns and the bespoke realities that you describe. So before I get into what happened to you, I want to ask how much of this book was written before you became what you call somewhat mockingly in the book, the main character of one of these campaigns.
So
was this a set of theories that you developed partly in response to what was in an ongoing way happening to you, or had you already developed what's really the first 3/4 of the book when all of a sudden, there's a test case going on here, me? What's the relationship between the Renée DiResta story and the theory that the book articulates?
So most of the book had been scoped. I think I got the contract for it in summer of 2022. And so I had written the outline and I had written some draft chapters, and I actually really didn't want to be in the story. Actually, it was not something I wanted to do. I wanted to write a book like Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which is actually kind of laid out in a similar way, right? Here's the model of the universe. Here are the case studies. And I wanted to do something very similar.
Although you had the good sense not to start it with, your book starts with a good sexy topic like vaccine denial and measles. If I recall manufacturing consent correctly, it opens with a group of Brazilian bishops issuing a peace statement, and wonders why this didn't get a lot more attention. And my reaction to that at the time when I was a young journalist who read it was, because it was a group of Brazilian bishops issuing a peace statement, why? What's the news there?
Yeah,
that's a bit of a detour.
Well, no, it started off as like, I want to write a book about modern propaganda. And then we got the Twitter files, you might remember, began in like December 2022. That's where the sort of first ones come down. And I had a lot of opinions about it. I was writing about it because I felt like it was a kind of a weird cherry-picked version of what content moderation was. And, and I wrote, hey, wouldn't it be great to see something like some statistics here? Wouldn't it be great to see some data? We're getting these weird cherry-picked anecdotes where, Matt Taibbi takes an email, cuts it in half, highlights 2 words in yellow, emphasizes the 2 words in the tweet, and like nobody seems to read the actual text of the email, which often undermines the point he's trying to make. And I thought, what a weird, what a kind of bizarre universe this is. But Elon was thrilled with it. And so he kept boosting it. And then all of a sudden, they started writing about us. And, I said, okay, well, now the work that we did on the election has all of a sudden become part of this weird conspiracy theory. In which they're claiming that we somehow censored 22 million tweets. And this narrative had been percolating around right-wing media for several months prior to that. It had begun kind of around August or so, of the summer of 2022. And we thought it was just, okay, this is like crank stuff that these people are writing. Nobody in their right mind will take this seriously. If there were 22
just
million
people on
tweets,
the internet, you thought.
Well, look, there are always going to be fringe alternate theories with crank media writing about them. Like, welcome to the internet.
Right. But I mean, here's you being the CDC. You looked at a bunch of cranks on the internet and you said, no one's going to take that seriously. We produced a bunch of peer-reviewed papers. And,
not exactly.
And then all of a sudden...
It's a good point.
You said
close.
They'll never compete against us experts.
No. Actually, not at all. We did think, okay, there's going to be this niche universe of people who are going to believe this, and that nothing we say will change their minds, right? And so it's not worth engaging, because no matter how many times we try to fight on the facts, they have their theories. And again, no commentary from an expert is going to fix that. But what you see start to happen, and again, when it stays in like, the sort of niche far-right alternate blogosphere, look, there's nothing I can do about that. Let them do their thing. That's what they do. That's how they make their money. But what starts to happen is that the Twitter files moves it into the mainstream. And that's when those of us who were intimately involved in it, me, Alex, Kate, said, okay, now we have to respond, right? At this point, we have to begin responding. We have to correct the record. We have to fight back. And unfortunately, that is where you see the gap with the institutions, right? Institutions have their own set of incentives. The institution will protect itself. The institution will work to ensure its own continuity. The institution wants to make sure that, when letters and requests for documents and subpoenas come down, that none of its other funding or programs are jeopardized. And that is the way of institutions. This is not a normative statement. This is reality. The problem is, this is where you see the point in the book, which is once the rumor mill is there, if you give nothing back, it's only going to ossify. And once it hits a certain threshold, you actually do have to respond. And this was what we were telling election officials during the election. This is what we were telling public health people during COVID. You don't need to respond to every random fringe blog post or, guy with 6 followers who's saying something. But when you start to see that snowball beginning, you do have to intercede. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, the institutions still see it as, well, if it's not in the Washington Post, it doesn't really matter. If it's not in the Washington Post, it's not a crisis that university comms has to go handle. And, obviously in the book, I'm writing about my own experience because I'm saying this is completely wrong. This is the worst strategy ever. Come on, guys, we gotta do something here. But as this is happening, it's funny, the book was already in edits or layout or one of those things as the university president debacle begins. Do you remember that? Where a bunch of university presidents are called in to testify. And, they're prepped
and they
by
can't
these,
manage to say that advocating killing Jews is actionable under their hate speech codes.
It was an absolute disaster. Everything about it was a disaster. The communication was a disaster. The silence afterwards was a disaster. The realization that what was really happening was not what was going to happen in that room. It was what was going to happen on Twitter after they left that room. And that was where, watching that dynamic play out, I thought, this is a problem of institutions not realizing what is happening today, where public opinion is going to be formed, or when you're giving that statement in that hearing, understanding the 6-second clip that's going to be taken and how that will be decontextualized and moved into a place. And then also not properly kind of getting their boards to understand what's going to happen, not realizing that they themselves are going to be scrutinized, right? It's very, very difficult to, even for, in the targeting of us, they could never actually discredit the work we did. They had no smoking guns of 22 million censored tweets because it didn't happen. So what they did instead was they worked to create the impression that we ourselves were some sort of like evil, bad people. And that's where things like, oh, she used to work for the CIA. That's how that becomes useful. There is no argument that they ever managed to make about like, what does the CIA do to me today? What did the CIA do to me when I was at Stanford? What did my handlers want me to do? Like, they don't understand how it works. There is no there. And so it's just the mere insinuation is enough. And it is very hard to refute the insinuation.
Who is Michael Benz?
Oh, he's this guy that spent, I think, 3 months as like a deputy assistant secretary of something at the State Department. He'd been a speechwriter for Ben Carson for a bit. I think did some work at the White House, but ultimately he had a past as a sort of racist extremist troll who used the name Frame Games. And in his capacity as Frame Games, he made a lot of arguments about how you had to frame stories to, win over your opponents. Basically, he essentially was making the same kind of arguments about propaganda that I lay out in the book, except he was, advocating for kind of operationalizing them for the sort of alt-right culture that he was part of. He then tried to nuke that entire aspect of his past. And when he left the Trump administration, when the election was over, he became a person who was starting to just make a bunch of allegations about us, and that was the dynamic that started to happen. He just wrote a whole lot of like purely baseless, they censored 22 million tweets. Okay, where's the evidence? There is none, but he wrote it down, and he became the single source for that narrative. It's kind of amazing, right? Every right-wing media outlet has been pulling from his kind of commentary, his opinions. They're really just nothing more than opinions, but they put him on every single television program, every single podcast, Tucker, you name it. And he just says this stuff, this purely baseless bullshit. And he's the only source they have. There's no evidence, but he's willing to say the thing. And that's how narrative laundering works. You just find the one guy that all of your other kind of outlets can cite. And that's how that's how you turn a crank theory into reality today. He became a source for Schellenberger and Taibbi.
Oh, we're going to get to Schellenberger and Taibbi in a minute. Why have the people you've just described, a very influential person albeit one with a bit of a shady past, and one who is spouting theories that are, probably defamatory, but certainly not true about you, that are very consequential for your life. And yet most people who are listening to this will have never heard of this person.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you why that is the case, that somebody can be that influential using platforms that we all use, and yet be completely invisible, one might say an invisible ruler, to the vast majority of people who are listening to this.
Because one of the things that happens is the creation of lore, right? So you have a person who's willing to repeat over and over and over and over again the same crank theories, and he tries to make it, it's like sexy sounding bullshit, right? They had an AI censorship Death Star super weapon. What the hell does that mean? Nobody knows, but people on Twitter are like, yes.
But if you're going to be Darth DiResta, you need a super weapon, a censorship super weapon.
AI censorship Death Star super weapons. I'm like, it was a bunch of Stanford students like reading the internet, but that's not a convenient reality, right? So you just wave your hand, say some bullshit, and and they pick it up and they run with it. And then you see him connecting with other people who are influential, who then legitimize him, right? So the way that these narratives get to a congressional subpoena is that Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi are invited by Jim Jordan to come testify in front of the Weaponization Committee on the Twitter files. Right?
And just to be clear, before you go on, who are Schellenberger and Taibbi?
Oh, they're Substack writers. They're, newsletter trolls.
Although in Taibbi's case, he's a particularly important Substack troll because he has had the backing of Elon Musk, who released a huge volume of Twitter emails to him.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's hard to know what people know about the story. And this is actually where I'm going to go with this, which is it becomes lore and you don't see it if you're not following those Substacks. A lot of it happens behind a paywall, right? Some of the crazy stuff they write about me, I only find out about it because I start to get death threats and then I have to go try to figure out what the hell they said behind the paywall. So if you're not paying to follow these people, if you're not in that media universe, if you're not in that bespoke reality, and many people in, kind of normie land saw the first one or two Twitter files and then said, this is kind of bullshit, and then checked out and never paid attention again. But you can look at Wikipedia because it's very interesting, because you see this phenomenally passionate fandom that wants every single aspect of them documented because they think that this is the expose of the century. And Schellenberger and Taibbi sell it to them as the expose of the century. And then they do that under oath in a congressional hearing. And so under oath in the congressional hearing, they submit written testimony that essentially regurgitates not things they've actually seen themselves in the Twitter files, things that Mike Benz has written on his blog. So this nonsense about 22 million censored tweets, which becomes the number that right-wing, that Jim Jordan was retweeting somebody talking about it today, or whoever runs the House GOP Twitter account was retweeting somebody talking about these 22 million censored tweets. It just never happened, but they said it under oath in his hearing. And so that provides Jim Jordan and everybody else with a citation, right? So now all of a sudden they can cite Matt Taibbi says, Michael Schellenberger says, they don't even have to go back to the original source of Mike Benz, who again is the only person saying this thing, because now they have other people who are saying it. So by having multiple different types of citations, they create a perception that this is real, this is true, and a lot of people are talking about it. And that's the process by which that machine takes some random crank comment and turns it into an alternate reality. And if you are not deeply following that lore, that cinematic universe, it takes ages to explain it all. And that becomes a problem for the people who are targeted. Because it means anytime somebody says something, I have to go back to what is it? God, last year, March of 2023, when the first letters from Jordan began to come down.
So just so that people don't come away with the wrong impression, where does the number 22 million come from, and what did it represent, if not the number of tweets that Renée DiResta personally removed from Twitter, thereby throttling the free speech of their creators?
Yeah, I think they said we used the AI censorship Death Star to nuke entire narratives from the internet. So what are those narratives?
Right. So what did you actually do with 22 million tweets?
No, so we counted them. That's it. So so during the election, like I said, we have these student analysts who are there, and they're looking at, rumors, misinformation. Sometimes it is state-sponsored disinformation, things that are happening, and they're kind of like logging them, right? And after the election, before January 6th, but after the election, what we do is Kate Starbird's team at UW goes and we make a list of the kind of most, of the keywords relating to the most viral narratives of the 2020 election. So this is stuff like Sharpiegate, right? That claim that Trump supporters were given Sharpie markers in Arizona to invalidate their ballots. It's things like Dominion, right? Which won a $787 million settlement with Fox News, but the narrative about Dominion, which I think most people probably saw, was that Dominion voting machines had changed votes. There was the weird stuff that you had, release the Kraken, Sidney Powell, and that whole hammer and scorecard, that a CIA supercomputer was changing votes. So what we did was, after the election, we literally ran a bunch of searches to try to find all of the tweets related to these incidents, because again, we had only seen a few of them at a time. And so at the end, we wanted to write some summary stats about how viral these had actually gone. And literally, we just did that search, pulled down the tweets, added them up, made a table, and stuck it in a report that sat on the internet for 2 years before people began to get upset about this. So 22 million tweets was just the sum total of the tweets relating to the incidents that we had kind of cataloged and followed. They were the most viral tweets and stories of the 2020 election, not the ones that had been, quote unquote, suppressed. I think if you were to go to Twitter and type in Sharpiegate or Dominion or Hammer and Scorecard today, you'll still see all that content up there on the internet.
And to the extent that some of those tweets may later have been removed because they violated some of Twitter's terms of service for one reason or another, did that have anything to do with the work that you guys did?
So one of the things that we would do is, if there was something that appeared to be going viral that violated the platform's terms of services, sometimes a student analyst would kind of create a ticket, and then a manager would go and look at it. And if they decided that it rose to a threshold where it looked like it was going viral and it looked like it violated a platform policy, they would tag in a platform. So one of the platforms. And it was just a way to say, hey, look at this. Hey, there are these narratives about Sharpie markers in Arizona. We didn't have the power to make a platform do anything. And what you see in the report that we do, we actually go back and we look at the approximately 4,000 URLs that we tagged over about a 6 to 8 month period. And what you see is that 65% of them are never actioned at all. So far from this theory that we were like somehow managing to make even the 4,000 tweets did not come down. I think 13% of them were actioned in some way that involved a takedown. 65% of them were nothing at all. And about 20% got a label. But in order to create this perception of a mass censorship campaign, they also tried to retcon the idea of a platform label into being some form of censorship. So a platform posting a fact check was the platform censoring conservative thought. Donald Trump says something, the tweet stays up, Twitter puts up a little sticker that says, this claim is disputed. And all of a sudden, they want you to see that as some sort of egregious act of censorship.
So it's fair to say that the element, and it's really trivially small, of truth in the 22 million censored tweets is that you guys did research that flagged 22 million tweets. You had a mechanism
we didn't flag 22
to
million
alert.
tweets at all. No. Just to be clear, the 22 million
No, you
tweets counted 22 million tweets after the election.
After the election, you had a mechanism in real time that you could, by the way, everybody has a mechanism. They can file complaints about tweets that you could identify potentially infringing tweets to the platform, and the platform decides what to do with them. And in a very large percentage of the time, those tweets are still up. Is that a fair summary of the?
Yes.
All right. So I want to talk about what happened to you once a group of influencers and a platform, which is to say now Twitter under the ownership of Elon Musk, and in this case, an additional element, which is allied congressional members who control a committee, an important committee, and some state attorneys general, all team up with this loopy conspiracy theory that Darth DiResta and Alex Stamos are wielding the super Death Star AI to repress conservative speech. Give us a brief summary of like how it affects your life. What happens when this kind of a set of influencers using this platform and this crowd decide that you are, as you put it in the book, the Darth Vader figure?
First, there's the legal implications, right? Which means that, Matt Taibbi says some stuff and then Jim Jordan gets to read my email, right? Because the university will turn over your emails as it has to under the subpoena. The subpoenas were very, very sweeping, right? They wanted all emails between all members of SIO, between us and the federal government, the executive branch, and between us and the tech platforms. This is where your lawyers, then you have to have a very expensive legal team, right? So this becomes a financial implication as well. We were covered by the university, right? Stanford did a great job protecting us on the legal front. The Knight First Amendment Foundation also helped me connect with First Amendment attorneys because, you do also need your own protection. And that I think is something that, I spoke with some climate scientists reached out to me as the story was beginning to unfold. And they said, we have this thing called the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. And that's because we realized that, you are going to need your own representation. You are going to, you're not necessarily going to always be aligned with your institution. And we all as a community went through this ourselves. And then we set up this entire nonprofit to help people in climate science who are targeted much the way that you're going to be. So that was sort of a, interesting bit of advice. So first, all of your emails and documents are going to go out. They are, in this day and age, they will likely be leaked, right? They will be leaked, particularly if there is no smoking gun within them. If there's nothing that is actually useful because you've done nothing wrong, you don't just, they don't just say, oh, you did nothing wrong, we're sorry for wasting your time. They turn your emails over to people who will write just lunatic theories because, again, they assume that they're never going to get sued. So they just write this stuff. They use innuendo sometimes. Other times they're overtly defamatory, but they write this stuff and they sort of serialize it for their fans. So this material is leaked, right? That is the point. And then when they write this stuff, you're going to get death threats. That's what's going to happen next, right? And you and your family and everybody else are going to get put through the ringer because this crowd has been told that you did something to them. You censored them, you hurt them, you did whatever to them. You are the villain and you did something to them and then they need their retribution. And that is the dynamic of things that happens. So you have legal issues, you have costs. We were also then sued by Stephen Miller. Jim Jordan took material obtained under subpoena and turned it over to Stephen Miller, which is somewhat unprecedented, I hear from legal folks. And, again, there's nothing you can really do about it, though. because the alternative is to fight the subpoena, and you have to have an institution that wants to go and do that. And, again, the institution has other kind of fish to fry. So it does become a little bit of a surreal experience, I think, for the individual person. And I heard that from a lot of the climate scientists also. Michael Mann has this phrase that he uses in his book. He was a climate scientist who went through a very similar experience, but before the internet. So he didn't have to deal with the online mob. He just had to deal with the rest of it. And he calls it the Serengeti strategy, right? Where they separate one zebra from the herd. I've actually seen this. Like I did my honeymoon. I remember going on safari, and you see the lions, and they go for the one zebra, and they pick it off, and then they all chase it, and then all the rest of the zebras go back. They go back about their business, right? Because the problem is solved. Like, they are not immediately under threat. That other guy, too bad for him. The lions are eating him, but the rest of the herd can go about its business. And it's a very evocative image, but it's actually quite a good one, I think, because that is in fact what happens, right? You do start to see. We were the first, I think, to go through this process of the letter to the subpoena to the, the various escalations. I think about 100 or so letters went out to various academic institutions, to various think tanks. They really began to try to run this absolutely massive, expansive, incredibly large investigation. And there is still no report indicating that there was actually some vast censorship cabal that did anything. So that's, a whole lot of noise.
And do you think the not at the level of the mass online who became a kind of mob against you guys, but at the level of the members of Congress, the people who sued you, do you think that they believe that there is that you are actually Darth DiResta, censorship goddess, or is it just a harassment campaign?
I really don't know. It's very hard to know that, right? I mean, Representative Dan Bishop is regularly out there retweeting Mike Benz. Even Mike Benz, by the way, does not limit his focus to us. He has this take on Taylor Swift is a Pentagon psyop, and everybody everywhere is somehow linked to the CIA. You just say CIA 3 times fast. It's like Beetlejuice. There's just like this, his entire MO is just saying CIA in ominous tones, and then connecting whoever it is he's targeting or whatever issue it is to some CIA thing, myself included, right? But you have these elected officials you would think would know better, or would you think would recognize it as bullshit. Dan Bishop chairs the House Homeland Security Committee. But, he's out there, just kind of out there just hitting the retweet button, right? Or the quote tweet button. And, does he know? I don't know. Does he boost it anyway? And does that have a significant effect? Yes, absolutely. And he's running for Attorney General in North Carolina right now.
So I want to return to where we started, which was the decision of Stanford University to not have you guys running the Stanford Internet Observatory anymore, or maybe not to have a Stanford Internet Observatory anymore, or maybe to have one in a different form. I look at this and I can tell one of two stories, right? So one is Stanford had Internet Observatory run by 2 non-tenured faculty, which is to say second-class citizens in a university environment. And these two did some good work, but they embroiled the university in a major political controversy that involved a lot of cost for the university, that involved a lot of angry people, some of them kind of dangerous. And that was not what they knew they were signing up for when, they decided to have an internet observatory. And who needs this shit, I think, is the technical university term for that sort of thing. And so just make it go away. And it's not like any of our tenured faculty, who are the only people who really matter in a university, other than students who can make Title whatever complaints. Those are so just make the problem go away. That's the sympathetic version. The unsympathetic version is that Stanford defended itself to the extent that you guys needed to be defended in order to defend the university. You guys got swept in and defended along the way. But a major research institution of the highest caliber wouldn't stand behind the work in the sense that the real sense that matters, which is the sense of not stopping doing it in the face of political pressure. Which one of these stories, or both of them, is the true story at the highest level of altitude behind what Stanford has done?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I mean, one thing I think I want to make clear is that the committee was willing to demand the emails and internal work product of undergraduate students. That is extraordinary, right? The depositions that some of the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana do name-checked undergraduates because they had internships at, for example, DHS CISA. A bunch of interns, a bunch of 19-year-olds.
They didn't even have internships at CIA?
No.
Come on, what kind of CIA operation is this if they don't even get the students?
I'm not recruiting the next generation or whatever. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, they went after kids, right? And I will say Matt Taibbi dumped emails, the emails of undergraduates, and then those kids got threats, right? And that's just extraordinarily fucked up in every way. I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to say that, but it
No, you're very much allowed to.
It's
we earn our rating,
right?
every episode.
I just feel like, look, those of us who are adults and in leadership, we understand what's happening. We understand what we're doing. But when you go after kids, like, that's really just absolute, just scumbaggery. It's intimidation at that point. And so I do understand universities not wanting to be in a position where students are put at risk. I will also say, though, that nothing that we did in EIP or in Virality Project was secret or concealed or anything other than absolutely totally public at all times as we did the work. And so when it was getting extraordinary amounts of media attention, and when Surgeon General Murthy chose to launch his one of his health advisories with a webinar with us, or times when very, very senior officials were extremely grateful for the work that we did, I think the university was quite proud of it. And so that's where I would have liked to see a little bit more support. Like, you can't love a project where you know what's happening and be so supportive of it. It's very fair weather. And that, I think, for me, as at a personal level, was deeply disappointing, actually, that this was something that the university was extraordinarily proud of, that the administration, that leadership was incredibly proud of, until all of a sudden it became the focus of a witch hunt, and and that's where we are.
I have one final substantive question before we go to the chatter box and pull out one of our famed random questions for our guests. And that is, last night you had a book party for the release of this book. And I just want to ask whether you would like to share with our listeners where that book party took place.
Well, it's convenient because they have a big party room. But we had the interview was at Politics and Prose in Northwest DC, and then Comet Pizza, Comet Ping Pong is about 4 doors down. Comet, I think, is it's almost its own character at this point, right? It's in the book. In the case of Pizzagate, of course, the story is there was a secret basement. Hillary Clinton was running a sex dungeon down there. And then a man showed up with a gun, because that is actually the point in the book, right? This stuff doesn't just stay on the internet. People actually show up with guns at times. And Comet, I feel, is actually in some ways, like, I really admire the fact that they stayed open, right? The fact that they continued to be a neighborhood institution, the fact that it's busy when you go in there and get pizza, right? I've been there maybe, I think 3 times now. And, I sort of see it as like an entity that kind of stood up to it and thrived.
Yep.
And so I was very happy to go there and eat pizza and play ping pong last night.
It is my neighborhood pizza place, and I think everybody who, that incident had implications for all of the businesses along that strip, including Politics and Prose, because, guys showing up with guns to rescue fictitious children from a basement that doesn't really exist. There is a sort of half staircase down to the party room, but we don't count that as a basement. And in any event, there are no children being held there. When that happens, that affects the security of all the institutions along that strip, and it did. And I'm actually very proud of the neighborhood reaction. There was a lot of people in the neighborhood made a point of eating at Comet over the next several months, and people felt very strongly about it. All right, we're going to reach into the chatterbox, pull out a slip of paper. For those of you online who can watch this on YouTube, I really did just reach into a box and pull out a slip of paper. What advice would you give now to the 20-year-old version of yourself?
Oh, man.
And I'm going to shape that question a little bit and ask you to answer it with specific reference to the story that we have just talked about.
Yeah. Well, I think when I'm trying to remember what year I was 20 in. I think it was like right around September 11th. Right. Yeah. So, at the time, it was when I was deciding if I wanted to stay at the agency or leave, actually. And I actually couldn't, I really struggled with that. Which
is why you decided to be a secret employee of the agency for the next and be their outside censorship guru.
No, you know what it was?
It's kind of like a little bit of the best of both worlds professionally.
The Iraq War was starting as I was graduating, and I was deeply uncomfortable with that. I wound up getting arrested in a New York City protest and the whole bit, So I was, I was pretty anti-war and struggling with my feeling that intelligence is supposed to keep you out of wars, right? And here we were, and then of course bad intelligence becomes a key component in that story. But I left because I felt like I would always find, if I did something I was interested in, I would be happy. If I did something that I found like compelling, I would be happy. And so it's funny, the next thing that took me to was Jane Street, but that was because I was like, wow, look at this crazy stuff I know nothing about. And it seems so exciting. And look at, high frequency trading and derivatives arbitrage. It's like playing poker very fast with large sums of money. And I do think that sense of doing something you're interested in really is I am happy that 20-year-old me made that decision. I might have just said be more strategic, get a graduate degree. I don't know. Every now and then I do think should I have done it? Should I have gone back to school or gotten the proper credentials or whatever? And I actually still don't know what the answer to that is, but I think overall I'm pretty happy with even my current very dramatic set of circumstances. I'm pretty happy with where I am.
We're going to leave it there. Renée DiResta, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.